The purpose of this session is to really help us explore how we think effective change happens. And I'm joined today by 4 different people from different perspectives. We've got Rachel, Julia, John, and Phil, who are going to help us explore this question. I'll just kick us off really with a question to you, John, in what do you see as the role of business and markets in enabling change?
Thanks, Anna. So, I think the first thing I would say is that it is inevitable that if we are to successfully move towards a low carbon, indeed zero carbon and climate resilient economy, then there will have to be a role for business in the sense that businesses are currently responsible for the vast majority of the emissions that we see in the economy, and they face many of the climate risks that we're going to have to deal with. So, for instance, it will be the heating engineers who have to move from installing gas boilers to installing heat pumps, or it will be the hotelier who has to worry about how her hotel is going to be able to respond to greater flood risk and what changes she should make to her hotel in order to be more resilient to those sorts of risks. So in one kind of narrow sense, it's inevitable that business has to be part of the change. But I think perhaps more fundamentally, the question is, do we think that business can be driving that change and be really a kind of an agent or a catalyst for that change? And here, I'm cautiously optimistic. I do think there are some signs that we are seeing and have seen to suggest that business is really capable of helping deliver the sorts of changes that we see. So take a kind of a really classic example. When I started working here on this topic about 12, 14 years ago, it cost around about 3 times more to generate a megawatt hour of electricity from offshore wind than it did from gas-fired power generation. So it's 3 times more expensive. And over the course of the last 12 years, we have seen those costs come down through a combination of innovation and scale, such that today those costs are pretty much the same. And looking out into the future, I think we can be confident that many renewable energy technologies will actually be cheaper than the traditional technologies. And that's a process which has been driven, at least in part or in large part, by businesses seeking to innovate, seeking to gain competitive advantage. And so in that sense, I think there can be a really important role for business in helping us to achieve the sorts of changes that we want.
Really. So I'm going to then jump over then to Rachel, though, because I think we can then think like change can. So why don't we just let the market get on with it? So is there really a role? Like, we're here to talk about the role of policy and the role of how, what's the role of the state or the policy and the government in helping that? Can businesses and innovation and technology drive this change, or is there more that we need?
Yeah, so I think we'd argue that we need to see action from business, of course, but also action from communities and from government. And we need all 3 to be acting together. And that we can't lean kind of too heavily on any one of those points, if you kind of imagine it as a triangle, because each of those points are going to be critical in delivering a just transition to a sustainable future. And government has a really important role to play in shaping that transition. Both by creating new green jobs that are accessible to everyone, by supporting people to retrain or to gain new skills to make them move from high carbon industries like oil and gas into good quality jobs in growing low carbon industries. And really fundamentally, we'd argue that government has an important role to play in setting the direction of markets. So those emerging and growing green industries, for example, in building offshore wind turbines like we've already seen in Scotland, but also in supporting the creation of those good quality local jobs, for example, by creating parts for those wind turbines. And I think we'd argue that left to markets alone, the last 40 to 50 years tells us that we won't see action on the scale we need to deal with our climate emergency. And we won't see a transition that narrows inequalities, that protects communities and local economies, and that's paid for fairly. So that's where government has a really critical role in that triangle to play. And finally, we think government has a really important role in shaping democratic decision-making processes over these really important decisions, so that workers and communities can be heard and brought together with business, and so that we can ensure there's a just transition that doesn't leave people or places behind.
I'll come to Phil then. So you obviously work with local communities in Scotland. So what's your view in terms of what they need and how they can, what's their part in creating change for the climate emergency?
Well, I actually agree with what both the speakers have said in terms of the need for a wee bit of carrot and stick. I firmly believe that no one sector is going to be able to stand on its own post-COVID. So this is a fantastic opportunity for public and private and community sectors to come together. In Scotland, we've already got very good internationally recognised policy around towns. We're just about to refresh that strategy and send in a much more ambitious programme to government in December. And hopefully we'll have a very ambitious programme in January to take forward. A lot of it's underpinned by the need to bring communities on board. It's fine having government policy, but ultimately you only get that policy working where you get citizens to change their behaviour, not just corporates, not just institutions, but citizens primarily. So we have already started that journey with our Love Local campaign, a return to localism, the fundamentals of fairness. Because before COVID, the economy didn't work for most people. It was very, very unjust. It had become so extractive in how it was constructed that so much wealth was concentrated in too few hands. So how do we get a complex agenda down to the people on the ground so they feel as if they can contribute? And that's what the Love Local campaign has attempted to do, starting off with reminding people that they can't change the world, but what they can do is change the stuff around them that's meaningful for their families, for their local environment, for the green space, for their local high street, for resilient food supply chains, etc. So that has been the message we've been trying to underpin.
Yeah, no, so thank you. And so we can sort of look at, okay, so the markets need to play their part, government can play their part, and communities can play their part. That, you know, as you said, Rachel, the triangle. And yet, Julia, are we doing enough? Like, what's not getting us there? Why are we not succeeding? Why are we still in the state that we're in?
So one of the things that's quite interesting is if we have a more equal system with clean technologies, both on the production side, so for renewable energy, low carbon energy, and on the consumption side, which is often neglected, which is basically technologies that allow us to live our daily lives without consuming lots of resources, such as housing retrofit and livable cities, walkable cities, good public transportation networks. So if we have those things, and also, you know, food supply chains that don't are not fundamentally unsustainable, if we have that kind of investment, it is entirely possible for us to live well and not suffer at all from quality of life decrease and be within our environmental limits. The problem is that there are really big obstacles that are actually driving us constantly in the other direction, very strongly so. And a lot of those do have to do with basically who's been the powerful industries and how they've been sort of bringing government over to their side through budget shares and subsidies. And we really have these very strong economic structures that reward very bad behavior. So we have corporate actors who've been lying, like the fossil fuel industries, who knew, as long as I've been alive, more than 40 years, that they were driving climate change and refused to tell anybody about it, not their investors, not the government, and who still to this day receive a lot of subsidies from us. So they receive our tax money. And so we're not even stopping doing the bad stuff. So I think one of the things that we really need to change is we really need to stop doing the bad stuff through our governments, through our private consumption, and through our support for industries that are like the tobacco industry. They took a lot of the same methods in terms of disinformation and tried to convince everybody that we need them, that we are addicted to them because they're good. But no, we're addicted to them because they're drug pushers. And I think that one of the things that really matters is citizen activism. So it's not just being active in your locality or state officials trying to do the right thing. It's basically taking that responsibility of realizing we're in a struggle and there's a battle to be won here. On the one hand, we can live well forever on a safe planet in a good environment under good conditions. And on the other, there's going to be a lot of destruction and suffering coming our way. And I think that we need to take the responsibility of realizing that we're in that battle. And the people who've been fighting us have been hiding that fact from us for a very long time.
So coming back to that as an interesting provocation around, okay, so we've got powerful industries, economic structures, we haven't got the right subsidies. we got consumption patterns, and how much activism have we got, that kind of activism. So how do you respond to that in terms of, you know, markets or policy? So John, or how do you want to come in?
So there's an awful lot there that Julia said that I would agree with, in the sense that the current economic model clearly hasn't been set up in a way which encourages the sort of sustainable and resourceful economies that we need so desperately, and that we need to start changing those rules of the game so that we actually can secure the green growth that we want to see, and the climate resilience that we want to see. And I think the thing to me is, it's coming at it from a kind of an economic perspective, is Julia talked a lot about the subsidies and the incentives that have been created around fossil fuel industries. And for me, a big part of the change is around creating the right incentives for clean and green technologies to replace those alternatives, to replace those fossil fuel industries. And I think there's a really important role to be played to create, through policy, it will have to be through policy, but to create through policy the sorts of financial incentives that actually tell people, that reward people for clean behavior, both on the demand side and on the supply side. So both in terms of what they produce and in terms of what they consume.
We do need to make it easier, I think, as both Julia and John were speaking to, people to make to kind of have the policy environment that enables people to make kind of cleaner choices. But that alone, I think, isn't going to get us to where we need to get to, and then definitely not in the timescales that we need to get there. I think most people would agree that there is a role for regulation where there are kind of immediate bads, that need to be stopped now, and there's a huge cost to not stopping those things from happening now. So where there'll be parts of this transition that kind of work on a longer timescale, and there can be kind of campaigns and targets and incentives as a first step, and we kind of transition towards harder regulation later down the line. There's definitely a place for that. I think there are kind of clear areas where regulation does need to come in now, and we can't really spend, we don't have the time to spend another kind of decade talking about when that point's going to come.
Brilliant. And what impact's that going to have? I think that's going to have if we bring in these regulations now, is that going to have an impact on communities as well? Like, how do we ensure, I guess, that we're considering people and fairness?
To give you an idea of some of the things we're suggesting within our Town Centre Action Plan 2, it's to rebalance the injustice. So we're looking at the introduction of carbon tax. We're looking at the introduction of digital sales tax. We're looking at taxing out of town car parking. We're looking at a moratorium, all out of town retail development. Why would you reward bad behaviour? And fundamentally, within the national planning framework, we're insisting on towns that relate to people, planet, economy. So if we get this embedded into the national planning framework, we will not see developers being able to drive the sprawl developments into the farmers' fields to stretch the infrastructure, which is totally unsustainable. One of the big policy levers that we are pushing for is the rebalancing of the disadvantage, where refurbishing property has a 20% VAT threshold, whereas building a new build house has a 0 rate. So why don't we just put the tax onto the stuff that's doing the wrong thing and actually take it away from the people that are doing the right thing? These are all quite simple policy changes that just need a bit of ambition from government and doesn't upset people's life. So
that's at the kind of rebalancing at the local level, but what also needs to be happening at like the rebalancing at the kind of whole economy level as well?
This is something that we need to consider, that the time for gradual transition and incentives, in my view, I'm afraid, is gone. We don't have that time anymore, and we need to be sending much stronger signals to the economy as to what kind of behavior is acceptable, which is behavior that rebuilds our own economies and that allows us to work for each other, and what behavior is completely unacceptable, and that's the behavior that's destructive, extractive, exploitative, creates inequality, creates pollution, climate change.
Thank you so much. Lovely way to end, really, but all of you really calling for that radical, immediate, ambitious pivot that we need for the transition, and really showing that we all have a part to play, the businesses, government and communities, and that we also need policies and approaches that can really address it.